everybody. What I'm going to talk to you about today is an article that I found concerning indirect objects. And I've titled this presentation, Indirect Objects More Than Sentence Elements, How Direct and Indirect Objects Could Change the Way History is Written. So I want to start off by just thinking about the purpose of what we're learning here in grammar. I know for me personally, I needed to take this class as a part of a teacher certification program. I'm not necessarily an English major or getting a degree in this. So for me, and I hate to admit it, but I'm kind of just checking off a box. So when we think about grammar and think about learning grammar, is it just good enough to know sentence structure and noun phrases and what goes where and how to diagram? Or does it have a deeper meaning? And I found this article and I want to share it with you because the question that I'm asking is, can sentence structure or noun phrases actually change history or influence history? So the research article that I found, in short, the study looks at scholarly historical articles about the American labor unions. And it investigates whether or not sentence structure or how people and organizations in the articles, in scholarly articles or research articles, gives insight into who has power in American labor unions. And if you're not sure what I mean by American labor unions, in just a minute I'm going to give you a little history lesson on exactly what that is. But just so you know, I'm a historian. My undergraduate work is in history, and I've been a social studies teacher for a very long time, about 17 years now. And so historians write about history and document what's going on in real time. As historians write about the history of American labor unions, who are they saying is accomplishing historical change or taking action? And this is what this article is about. It's called Who Done It and to Whom? Subjects, Objects, and Actions in Research Articles on American Labor Unions. It was written by Villia Holden. She's with the Department of History at the University of Colorado. This paper was written as part of a workshop on language technology for cultural heritage and social sciences and humanities in 2016 in Berlin, Germany. And it's published, this paper is published through the Association for Computational Linguistics. So what is this article about? Well, the author asserts that by looking at scholarly research and the documented history, that we can analyze sentence structures and noun phrases and separate out the subjects and the objects, whether it be the indirect object or the direct object. And by looking at that, we can determine who is holding the power. When you think about American labor unions and doers, as the term that the author uses, the doers are the subject of a noun phrase, and the done tos are the object, the indirect or the direct object. Most think about it in terms of the employers being the doers and then the unions being the done tos, or the leadership is the subject or the doer and the rank and file are the object. The unionized workers may be the subject, and then the unaffiliated workers are the object. So in noun phrases, or NPs, the doer is the subject and the person that holds the power, and the done to is the object. Let's talk a little bit about American labor unions. This just happens to be the time period and the subject of what this article is about, but it really could be used in any historical subject. But American labor unions, just to put it in perspective, the timeline we're talking about is about 1868 to 1914. That's late 19th century. Industrialization is coming into the United States. Cities are being urbanized. There's more factories. And so for the American worker, whatever your manager or your factory owner, whatever rules they set up for you working, that's what you worked. There were no laws in place for no child labor laws, no safety laws, no basic needs laws as far as an 8-hour workday or weekends. None of that was in place. You pretty much worked. You were at the will of the factory owner. And here are some pictures that you can see. You've probably seen these before with children working in factories, clearly unsafe conditions. And also, I have a map here that shows some of the strikes and labor unrest in the late 19th century. And it affected all aspects of American work, whether it be railroads or miners, factories. It didn't matter because there were no labor laws in place. So moving on, late 19th century, Samuel Gompers, he's pictured right there. I love saying his last name. He is the founding member of the American Federation of Labor. This is the first attempt at a organized union of workers to band together, pull together to fight for rights, for their own rights. And as we move into the 20th century, with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's pictured right there, his New Deal plan included labor reforms. This is going to be a real game changer for the American worker. So traditionally, the scholarship, or what historians wrote about the American labor unions, has been a historical account of how labor unions got started, such as the Wisconsin School of Labor Economic Thought. This was developed or led by a professor at the University of Wisconsin. His name was John Commons. His students actually went on to work in FDR's administration and wrote the Social Security Act and wrote the legislation for unemployment insurance and the 8-hour workday. So most of the history is focused on people, the early thinkers such as him, the New Deal programs, and really focused on the voice of the leaders of the American labor unions. But in recent history, there's been a shift in historical research and thinking. We now look at labor as an organized movement. It's more inclusive, which makes sense because you have more people of color, we have more women, especially after the 1950s. More women are going to go into the workforce. There are the restrictions of black people being able to work in certain jobs. Those are going to start to be lifted. So you're going to have more of these people going into the workforce. So the unions need to be more inclusive. So the history that's written about these are going to focus more on those different entities. The social history of the worker is really more of the focus rather than the focus on the history of the labor union as an institution or an organization. So what we're seeing in more recent history is the voice of the workers. So if you're thinking about in terms of who has power in these two different groups, the previous research is focused on the voice of the leaders and those leaders having the power, and then the more recent is the voice of the workers and those people having the power. To put it in another perspective for you, if you think about this in terms of other types of movement, shifting away just for a moment from American labor unions, but if you think about another movement like the civil rights movement, if you had to ask yourself who commanded the attention or who had the power in the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement in the 1960s, some of the leaders would come to mind. Martin Luther King Jr., I have his picture there, or maybe even Malcolm X. But if you look at even more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement, who would you say has the power in that. The Black Lives Matter movement has often been said it's what they call multi-polar, in that the focus is not so much on leaders, but more on the cause. Is this a useful strategy? Maybe. Should the Black Lives Matter movement have a forward-facing leader, like the Civil Rights Movement had Martin Luther King Jr.? And if you ask yourself, who does have the power? If you're writing a historical account about the Black Lives Matter movement, who would you say, or who would you have as your subject of having the power of this organization? Is it the media? Is it the protesters? Is there a leader that you could say, and just thinking off the top of my head, the ones that come to mind, because I've seen them over the last couple of days, maybe Al Sharpton or Benjamin Crump. I don't know. Not making a judgment on who should have the power. I'm just asking, if you were a historian writing an account today, who would you put in the subject of a noun phrase as having the power? And then think about who would be your object. So if the media is the subject, are your protesters going to be the object? Because whoever the subject is, whoever the doer in a sentence is, has the power. So if you're thinking about this, can you sway opinion about the cause based on this kind of, how this kind of a historical account is written? So if you write something today about the Black Lives Matter movement, and 50 years from now, it's in a middle school textbook, are you going to be able to sway or give an opinion about what this time was like for future generations? So this article is doing just that, but with American labor unions. So it's asking, the investigative question for this article is, can sentence structure and scholarly writing tell us who had the power in American labor unions? And the author attempts to do this. She had some research questions. She's asking very simply, does grammatical representation of the doers and the done to show the same power structure that is emphasized in scholarship? Who in academic writing appears as the doer, grammatically speaking? And do the actions associated with doers and done to modify the assumptions about who has power in this literature analysis? So what she did, how they got this information, was JSTOR. If you've ever been to Galileo and looked at the databases, then you probably know that there's a database called JSTOR. And luckily it's online. So, and the reason I say luckily is because with it being online, you can put in, using software, put in a query that will pull certain information for you. So she went to the database JSTOR and looked only for articles that were more than 9 pages, because that's a rich, robust scholarly research document. Her query was American Federation of Labor, and when she did that, it pulled over 4,000 articles, most of which were published after 1945. It also pulled a subset of almost 4,000. Both of these were analyzed with this computer software that looked for specific query terms. So the query extracted subjects, whether they were active or passive. This would also be considered the doer in the noun phrase from these research articles, and the person holding the power. It would also extracted objects, the direct and the indirect, the done to, and the entity that is maybe less powerful in doing the work. So how are we going to determine who holds the power and in labor unions and the scholarly literature? So given this data set, they were asking if there were any patterns of who appears as a subject, who appears as an object. There are patterns that were found. The data interpreted after selecting about 1,000 of the most frequent noun phrases, and I've got these listed right here. the done to entity that is less powerful doing the work show here in this table shows about 50 of the most common subjects and objects in the noun phrases here. So it starts off with workers and gives the total account of how many times these terms appeared in these scholarly articles. And so what about the question of who's portraying of having power and not in this scholarly research? So given this data that we had, we looked for patterns, and what we saw were patterns. The noun phrases were compiled and then calculated for each. The ratio of how many times it appeared as a subject, whether it was passive or aggressive, versus an object, whether it was indirect or direct. The ratio of subjects to objects were then deducted to rank with overall what they called subjectness or objectness in the articles. So what does this look like? And here is what it looks like in this table here. If you start off here, in other words, this is the most of the subjects, the terms that appeared as a subject, and as we go down, these are the terms that appear as more of the objects. So these, you could say, the subjects have power, these not so much power, as written in these scholarly articles. Excuse me. So here we have terms such as labor leaders. Here's Samuel Gompers, the police, conservative legislature, federal government. All of these entities, as they were written in these scholarly historical articles, are perceived as having power. Whereas if we come down here, it's about right here where it starts to change. It starts to change right about here with the unions, the railroads, white strikers, workers. These terms right here, these in a noun phrase are known more as the done tos, or the people who have less power. There were also some unexpected trends that were found as she looked at these articles. She took the topic of women as an object or a subject in the collection of articles that were given. As you can see, and this is, you can't really see this because this is very small print, but this is starting out about 1865 going all the way to 2015. If we're looking for a noun phrase that had the term women in it, as you can see, this starts off the literature where women are talked about kind of peaks right here around the 1920s. What reason? Well, because that's women's suffrage. And as you see, it kind of goes down during the 50s, because what were women doing? They're not in the workforce, and there were women in the workforce, but not in large numbers. But as you see, especially during the 60s and 1970s and on into the 2000s, you see that the mention of women in scholarly articles, where women are either a subject or an object in scholarly articles, really starts to even go off the charts. Another unexpected trend, or similar to this same trend, here is in figure 2, where the topic of women in this collection of articles, where it's either women's work, female family. Again, in the early 20th century, you have a kick up here around the 1920s, but boy, it really does go up, as you can see here, after the 1960s and during the 70s and on into the 2000s. So what does this mean for us in conclusion? Well, for me, what it told me was taking this grammar class is not just checking off a box. There is a real purpose behind this. And I've got this quote here by Winston Churchill. History will be kind to me because I intend to write it. We have a real opportunity to influence or perhaps even change history, to write history. The documented record is always from somebody's interpretation or somebody's perception. But knowing what we know about sentence structure, about noun phrases and subjects and objects, it's very important to keep this in mind as a historian, because you can actually change or influence somebody's opinion about what is being written, and it may be true or it could be swayed just a little. The article is along with the discussion post in this video, so I hope you get a chance to read it. It's super short. It's about 6 pages, but it's a really interesting read. So thank you, and have a great day.